Thanks very much. Well, I've given lots of talks in many places, but I don't think I've ever been in a symposium which is entitled The Vagina and Sexuality, and I find it really quite confronting. I'm here to, and look, I really admire what you guys do. You know, I've been in breast cancer my entire career, and I see lots of women's health problems. Breast cancer is obvious, the stuff in the pelvis isn't, and I really encourage you, and I think you do a great job. I'm here, but I have three hats. I founded a biotech company called Harvard Therapeutics, which is commercializing intellectual property. And I also have a very specialist clinic, Well and Health, which only deals with complex breast problems in high-risk people in conjunction with hormonal dysfunction. But I'm here today to actually talk on behalf of Adelaide University, where I was a founding member of the Dame Roma Mitchell Cancer Research Laboratory, and I bravely put up this 30-year-old photograph on the left of me with my dear colleague and long-term collaborator, Professor Wayne Tilley, who's the Dame Roma Mitchell Professor of Molecular Oncology. And what we've studied for 30 years was at the start a very obscure problem, and that was testosterone and its impact on breast disease. And after 30 years of research, I'm going to summarise all of our findings in one slide, and that's a de Goya painting. And I think that what we've come to the conclusion about is that testosterone, which is a critically important hormone in women, and estradiol need to be in perfect balance. When it's not in perfect balance, it ends in tears. And our first foray into the world of gynecology, which I think I missed that time in medical school because I'm completely ignorant on the subject, but when we crossed over was with hormone replacement therapy. Now, excuse I can't change old words to whatever it's called now, but combination HRT was our first foray. And the reason it was a foray is because when I did my thesis, it was on medroxyprogesterone acetate, and there's lots of reasons for doing that. But I was fascinated by utilising pregnant horse urine conjugated estrogen, and that's all we had at the time. And look, I'm not an anti-HRT person. I'm a very, very pro hormone replacement therapy person. But that's what we had. We milked the urine from pregnant mares to get conjugated estrogen, and those conjugated estrogen then went through the liver and had a profound effect on hormonal function by altering sex hormone binding globulin. What that did is sucked up all of the bioavailable testosterone. But we then moved on and thought, well, you know, Provera or medroxyprogesterone acetate, incredibly stable synthetic progestin, you know, used in male sex offenders. So it's an interesting combination, pregnant horse urine estrogen, which is 11 conjugated estrogens, and drug which is profoundly active. And it led us to do some molecular work and created a paper that got us into a lot of trouble. And that was that we discovered that medroxyprogesterone acetate is an endocrine disruptor. It disrupted the nature of testosterone function on the androgen receptor. This actually ended up with Wayne and myself in court in one of the largest lawsuits in American history against Wyeth as a result of this paper. But what it did is it showed us that there was a disruption occurring in the very, very subtle pathways. And unfortunately, that combination led to a really huge increase in breast cancer, which is the organ which I've dedicated my life. Now, I'm not being critical. I'm just saying this was the start of the evaluation of the importance when you disrupt normal endocrine physiology by disrupting something as important as testosterone. So, look, all of that molecular stuff was fascinating, but in real terms, this is what we saw. Now, on the left is a breast MRI. Now, I'm probably the largest order of breast MRIs in Australia because when you do a mammogram and a woman has ultra-high density, it's virtually a useless investigation. It misses cancers, probably at least 25% of the malignancies. So this is an MRI, and on the left, this is a woman in her early 50s who was about to go on combination HRT. And on the right is the consequence of it. Now, all that white fluffy stuff in the middle is a thing called background parenchymal enhancement. It's after the gadolinium injection is given, and it's an intense flush of metabolic and vascular activity in the breast. We know that dense breast tissue on mammography is dangerous, but this is much more dangerous because what this is doing is inducing a lactational type change in aging breast tissue with all of the genomic instability within that tissue, which can lead to breast cancer. And so background parenchymal enhancement, BPE, is now becoming the most important marker of response of what we do exogenously to the endocrine system in a woman in midlife. We don't like seeing this. And also what it does is it obscures one of our most important tools in finding the cancer, because we're trying to find a white thing in a white thing. So what else are we doing with hormones? Well, this is the one which actually worries me probably the most. It's always worried me, and I haven't reconciled this yet. So this is a young woman who was in one of the other trials I was involved in, and I'm sort of dyslexic, so I've got it back to front, I'm sorry. But on the right, her skin when she was taking the oral contraceptive, and below it is a mammogram, and all that white intensity we can now measure that density with a tool, an automated tool, which you see in the panel in the bottom right-hand corner. And so she had ultra-high density, but great skin. And it makes sense because the breast is a modified sweat gland of embryological derivation. So the skin and the breast have very similar functioning in response to hormones. So she goes on the pill, or she goes off the pill. What happens? Well, a sex hormone binding globulin plummets, her free testosterone elevates, and dihydrotestosterone gets liberated into the skin, and her breast density goes down. So effectively, we want the face on the right and the mammogram on the left. Now, how do we do that, and why is that important? Well, last year we decided that we were going to do something which was seminal, and this was a game changer for us, and this is published in Nature Medicine, which is a difficult task. Where we demonstrated that the androgen receptor is so critically important in breast cancer that it actually is the modulator of hormonal response. And this has resulted in a change in paradigm away from anti-estrogen via the classical pathways to agonism with androgens, so we don't induce mutational change in the tumour. Now, I'm not going to, this is a really complicated subject, but I wanted to highlight to you how important this androgen function is in what we're doing. So, how do we harness it? Well, I came up with an idea. Now, I'm missing something there, don't know why that happened, but in my little balance, there are two enzymes, 5-alpha reductase that creates 5-alpha dihydrotestosterone, 10 times more potent than testosterone, and aromatase that takes testosterone to estradiol in a tissue-specific fashion. There are certain conditions where you get over-amplification of aromatase. For example, endometriosis. For example, ultra-high mammographic density. So I came up with the idea of combining testosterone with a low dose of an aromatase inhibitor in a subcutaneous pellet. Now, by combining an insoluble with a soluble, we made a highly compressed matrix which has a unique pharmacological release pattern. And by doing it this way, we've been able to do this. So on the left is an ultra-high breast problem. Now, that's high parenchymal enhancement. And 2 years later, the middle panel is the complete obliteration of that. Now, we know if you drop this down, you reduce the risk of breast cancer significantly. And then a year later, the far right panel, there's some return, but the breast has undergone what's called involution. It's like a post-lactational change where the breast shuts down. Very important finding. but probably not of great interest to you, great interest to me, but it has significant importance in the management of pelvic disease. And this came out when we ran, and this was published last year. A dear friend of mine, Charles Aprinzi at the Mayo Clinic, and I ran this NCI-funded trial comparing transdermal testosterone in women who are receiving aromatase inhibitors for breast cancer with the implant. And it was a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. And what we found is that there was less joint pain. The transdermal testosterone did not work because you're going for physiological levels, and I don't think that is where we need to go. And I'll come back to that. So reduce joint pain, less hot flushes. Now, these are particularly unhappy women. They've had breast cancer, they've had mastectomies, they've had chemotherapy, they've been completely made aestrus, and they're particularly miserable. And so trying to actually find a way around this has been very important without increasing the risk of tumour recurrence. Less fatigue, mood swings, but the big one that dropped out, and we weren't even looking for this, was reduction in urinary incontinence. And all of these statistically significant against placebo, but that was really clinically significant because the women actually volunteered that information. Less polyuria, less vaginal dryness, less nausea, and better skin appearance, which I thought was interesting because we weren't inducing the oily androgenic change in these women because their tissue had been so dehydrated by what we were doing. So, in summary, testosterone is a powerful pro-hormone. When I say pro-hormone, yeah, look, it works by itself in binding to the androgen receptor, but it is incredibly potent within a tissue-specific context where you can push it one way or another way. Push it towards dihydrotestosterone or push it towards estradiol, which is something else we're looking at. And it utilises a tissue-specific overexpression of aromatase. You know, I'm now working with Susan Evans, who I'm sure a lot of you know, and you know, and I'm starting to understand the complexity of and terrible nature of endometriosis. And this is something where we actually believe that we have a role to play. But I want to, you know, make the statement: synthetic hormones are not like endogenous hormones. They have a promiscuity of action. They can function as endocrine disruptors. For example, I would call the oral contraceptive an endocrine disruptor, a big endocrine disruptor, which worries me significantly for multiple reasons. And you know, when you're treating with exogenous hormones, it's a drug. You treat it like a drug. There's nothing physiological about giving exogenous hormones to a woman. You're completely altering the physiological pathways. And so, and look, we use, for example, corticosteroids, you know, in huge doses, and we never even consider what the serum level is of it because we're using it as a drug. My approach to testosterone is that you maximize the tissue usage of it and minimize the side effects by tissue-specific alteration of the fulcrum in the way we're delivering it, and that's possible. It's a very powerful anti-estrogen, dihydrotestosterone, and it's a very powerful mediator of immune function. We'll find out next week whether we've got an orphan designation on a specific breast condition at the FDA, where we're using this combination as an immune reducer in autoimmunity. And testosterone was actually used in rheumatoid arthritis a long time ago. It's effective pain modulator in hormonally sensitive tissues. And I believe, even though some of the trials have failed, the androgen receptor is very prevalent in pelvic musculature, and it is a right target for the right specific delivery pattern of an androgenic compound. Thank you. And look, I would encourage you, I do encourage you, because I think what you're doing is a great unmet need. You know, it's quite obvious I deal in a disease which is horrendous and is a blight on society. But you know, what you're doing, I think, is is really important, and I hope that I've added to your knowledge on our cross-fertilisation of our areas. Thank you.